So what we're going to talk about today is, that was a really great question about, why don't we have an EBV for cow weight or calf weight relative to cow weight, and why are we interested in that? Obviously, if we could have a small cow that produces a huge calf, that's more economical, right? More income and less cost. We know cows, the bigger they are, the more they eat. But that's essentially what we're doing with economic indexes, but it's not just about cow weight and calf weight, it's about cows that get pregnant and their carcasses and everything else. It's all the inputs and outputs to the system. So it's a bit, we're going to talk about breed object indexes today, but I'm not the creator of breed object indexes. It was another Steve. I'm in the era where there's a lot of Steves, especially in Australia. So at my age group, there was a predecessor by the name of Steve Barwick. And I can remember as a visiting graduate student from Canada in 1995, going out to Trangie Research Station for a field day where Steve got up and talked about breed object indexes, maybe for the very first time, I think. And it was a brand new concept for breeders. That was a long time ago. So indexes have been around for a while, but what I find is the questions about indexes haven't changed. And recently, in terms of my life with American Angus, we rolled out some new indexes for the breeders. And that created lots of questions. And it's almost like we're answering the same questions that we're answering back in 1995 all over again. So when I was doing my PhD, the topic was about multi-breed evaluation. But when I was wrapping up in Australia, my advisor sends me an email and he says, "Oh, I've got a postdoc. If you're interested after your PhD when you're done, it's about developing selection indexes." And so that was the postdoc, and those indexes went on in terms of the ones we developed. We were doing the evaluations for the Leachman Cattle Company in the States, as Lucinda indicated, and that index basically became dollar profit, which Leachman now promotes. So, yeah, familiar with indexes from a way back now, but. Truth be told, I haven't actually developed the breed object system from the beginning. Matt has a lot more experience with it, so if we get into real prickly technical questions at the back, I might have to rely on my colleague to bail me out. So what is the whole idea of an index? I guess as a commercial buyer, it's really just to simplify selection. So, because of work from people like Matt and others, we're adding traits all the time. So, if Matt's stuff pulls out, we're going to have new traits related to body composition, new traits related to reproduction. And as a commercial buyer, we give, all the information. And we were doing it yesterday with bulls, and Ian had, all the information laid out there to look at. And there's a lot of EBVs. So there's all the growth EBVs and mature cow weight and birth weight and calving ease and the carcass and the days to calving and docility and structure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of information overload for commercial bull buyers because unlike, and we've always got a mix of people that look at those numbers. We got the seed stock breeders, and it's the same information we pass on to commercial buyers. The seed stock breeders eat, live, and breathe this stuff 24/7 all year round, and so they know all the numbers in and out. And but a commercial buyer uses the numbers once a year, so that's when they buy their bulls, and so they have to kind of retrain themselves. But really, the indexes are there to simplify it for selection. We're going to let's take all those breeding values that have they're all economically important. Some are more economically important than others, and we put them all together and boil it down into one number, which is related to profitability, and that is in dollars. In terms of dollars per cow join per year. So if we look at the difference in indexes, that's the scale. So a common thing that we often hear from in terms of multiple trait selection and putting multiple traits together is someone will say, well, you don't want to select on too many traits at once because you won't make as much progress. And that's actually true. You won't make as much progress in any of those individual traits as if you just selected for one or two or three. And I often hear people say, never select for more than three things at once because you won't make any progress, et cetera, et cetera. But the point with this, in terms of an economic selection index, is you're only selecting for one thing, and that is profitability. You want to make as much progress in profit as you can. As a commercial producer, you want to make the most money. That is your trait. And so if there is a trait that's related to profitability, you're better to put it in than to leave it out. And it's true, the more traits you put in, each one gets weighted less and less. You got one pie and you've got to divide it up, but you're still better to put all the traits in to your economic breeding objective than to leave some out and just chase 1, 2, or 3 traits. So that's what selection indexes are. Another thing, I think it's partly to do with how these things get developed and everything else, but we tend to work with the breed societies developed. So when I worked with American Angus, we're at the breed society and we're developing the indexes, and the board of directors, who are all a bunch of seed stock producers, are making the decision, are you guys going to turn this index on, or are you going to not turn it on? And as I'm talking to them and convincing them that we should turn it on, obviously we develop it with scientists think it's a good idea. What they've got to get around their mind is the index really is, in some ways, it isn't as much for them as it is for the commercial producer that buys their bulls, right? So that the profitability is not about the Rennie Lee's profitability or Wairuna's profitability, it's about their commercial customers' profitability. That's how the index is designed. And so just to give you an example, at the time we're talking about replacement rate, and in the US, the average replacement rate is 20%. And then the board of directors, some Angus breeder, oh, well, I keep a lot more heifers than 20%. So why would you have 20%? The point is, you're not the market. You're not commercial reality. On average, in the commercial world, it is 20%, and so that's what it should be in the index. The index should reflect commercial production. It shouldn't reflect stud stock production. And that's a distinguishing thing about indexes, is it's all about performance in the commercial environment. But obviously all our measurements come in the seed stock environment. So we want to improve carcass weight in commercial steers through a packing plant somewhere, but we're measuring live weight at a year of age in seed stock cattle. Or we want to improve lactation and estrus interval in commercial females out there in the real world, but we've got yearling seed stock scrotal measurements on bulls. But those things are correlated, so we take the measurements from the seed stock environment and we do our best to predict commercial outcomes, and that's what's happening in the breed object system. And literally, I think Steve Barwick is, I don't know the year he retired exactly, but he was even coming into the building here and publishing papers up till recently, but he was starting this way back in 1995. So it literally is a lifetime of work that's gone into this model and this breed object system that underpins it here in Australia for breed plan. So what do we need to know? We need to know things about current herd production and the environment that it operates in. And what you'll see in breed plan is there's different indexes. Some are for northern environment, some might be for grass-fed environment, some might be for grain-fed, and they give different outcomes in those different environments. So, and the herd structure management. The other thing is there's a vision of the future. And I guess I use the analogy when it comes to selection and designing an index. I use the analogy of basically shooting ducks. So if you're out sitting in a duck blind, or in New Zealand they call them a mai-mai, I don't know where that comes from, and the ducks fly past and you shoot at the ducks, you will never hit any ducks, right? You have to actually lead the duck and then shoot, and then by the time the shot gets there and the duck gets there, you can knock down a duck. And it's a bit like that with your breeding program. What are the prices today? Well, if that really isn't what you want to select for, because by the time you breed those females and their calves are born and then finished out and everything, it's years down the road before these selection decisions actually get realized. So you have to predict in the future, what are the prices going to be? What's going to happen to grain prices? What's going to happen to pasture? What's going to happen to cattle prices and everything else? You have to predict to the future a little bit, which is always very difficult, and that's just part of it. So the best vision of the future we have, the better, so that the selection decisions we make today is actually most relevant for where things are going. So just to make the point, there's things that that we can measure here in the seed stock environment, but it's how those things are related to what happens out in the real world on commercial farms that really matters, and all those relationships is really what breed object's all about. So we think about, again, back to the commercial breeder, you walk out into a pen of bulls like that, and you're faced with a string of numbers like that across all those traits. And even if you do live, eat, and breathe them every day, what's, for example, if I'm a 4.2 on ribeye area, where's that? Is in the percentile in terms of Angus or Herefords or whatever, and the bull that's 4.2 versus 3.8, is that a big difference? Not a big difference? It's a lot of scales and everything else to get your mind around. But the whole thing is those traits are related to things out there in the real world. So calving age, gestation length, birth weight are related to things like survival in calves. And things like cow milk and mature cow weight and things relates to feed costs, and we'll get to it later around cow size and feed costs. But bigger cows, they eat more, but they pay more when you sell them. So it's all of those things go into these indexes. So in some ways, it's actually a little bit. We've come to this juncture, I guess, in beef cattle, which is interesting. But way back when, if you look at other industries like dairy or pigs or poultry, indexes, that was just standard. Like if you would have said to them, we'll take your index away. Well, they would jump out of their skin. That is the main driver of selection for those companies, is their economic indexes. Where in beef cattle, when I was doing it as a postdoc, it was like somewhat kind of, and when Steve Barwick was standing up in 1995, it was all a bit controversial. And even here recently, in my experience, same questions come up. Well, we don't want to have a self-replacing all-round index because that's single trait selection, and we all know single trait selection is bad. Well, it's not single trait selection because all the traits go in. The whole idea is it's multiple trait selection. It is one number, but it's multiple trait selection. And really what breedobject is doing is it's saying, what are the traits that impact on the commercial sector? And now if you think about what Matt's work has been doing recently, it's okay, now what can we actually measure on cattle to get us better EBVs that predict those things? And then all those things would go into the index, and that is provides a selection tool. So just around, I think it's, there's been a lot of research on it. These are a number of papers have been published, and you can look at those. And I think the main point here is basically the system is peer reviewed. So people say, well, how do you justify the fact that you're going to put this negative emphasis on mature cow weight? I keep coming back to that because that is probably the prickliest thing here lately with new indexes, is there's more downward pressure on cow weight. Well, where do you come up with these numbers? Well, it comes from these studies where people have actually measured the energy it takes to keep a cow alive, basically, at different weights. So the versions, the V is nothing to do with V8s or V6s or engine size or something, but versions over time, and they've moved to breedobject version 6, which is distinctly different in some ways from its predecessor, breedobject version 4. I'm not too sure what happened to 5. Nobody knows. It never existed. But the biggest change is how feed is actually costed. So new information in terms of modeling, and it's essentially it's more elegant or elaborate or more accurate in terms of modeling the feed costs for both the growing animal and the cow, and we'll get into that here in a minute. But it actually accounts for change in weight and change in condition in cows, which it didn't do in the past. Now I'll just back up a little bit. I think it was COVID 2020, so the BIF was actually online. I'm back in America. Brad Walmsley's making a presentation about this slide right here. And for me, watching his presentation, I'm like, aha, Brad's got something there that other people haven't done. And that is, he's looked at the variation over time in terms of weight and condition. And instead of a lot of the thinking previous to this would be there's just some fixed differences. You know, if a cow puts on a condition score, it's X number of kilograms. But what this is showing is that's not the case. So if you're a lighter animal and you put on a condition score, you actually don't put on as much weight as a heavier animal putting on one additional condition score. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. You know, if you're a small animal and you put on a couple mils of fat, how much is that? If you're a much bigger animal, you put on a couple mils of fat, that's a lot more fat. It's a lot more weight. And this relationship that he's put together here in model and breed object, I think is fantastic. You know, I was a bit envious at the time, looking at it from the other side. The other thing that they're modeling here around condition is this distribution where there is an optimal in terms of condition. And if we shift condition in animals in terms of they get into this negative energy balance, for example, and they're sliding to the left, we're going to have, at the worst case scenario, and Matt said about those animals that, you know, ate up their muscle reserve so much they actually had, you know, eye muscle areas as small as sheep. You know, that's getting into the point where that's critically low condition. Those animals could die. That's obviously a loss. Then we get into the stage here where they don't die, but we're going to have to get them up to condition so they'll cycle and breed and everything else. We're going to maybe have to feed them or drop our stocking rate or both, and that's a cost. But on the other end, if we get them too fat, well, that's a waste because we just poured we were poured extra feed to put condition on animals, and now they're too fat, and we've just wasted some feed on those ones. But that is all modeled basically in the breed object system. So what's the impact of this? And this is where, if you're a commercial producer that buys bulls once a year, maybe you don't keep up on this, or the scuttlebutt, as we'd say in Canada. But there's been a lot of controversy amongst the breeders all around this feed cost thing because it determines what's the weight that's going to be on cow size. And it's the big cow versus smaller cow argument. And it doesn't matter where I go in the world, whether it's in Canada, New Zealand, America, or here, if you want to start a fight amongst the breeders, let's start talking about how big cows should be and big cows versus small cows. And that doesn't seem to go away. But the point here is that this is how two sires rank over different prices of feed costs. So if feed is basically free, you know, I'll come back to a story on that. If feed is basically free, this red sire up here is actually almost $250 more profitable than the blue sire. So, you know, if feed didn't cost anything, go for your life. He's the one to have. And obviously, as the feed gets more and more expensive, this bull becomes less and less desirable, and this bull becomes more desirable. And around $200, about $100, maybe $180 a ton. Those two bulls, there's not much difference between them. But as feed gets even more expensive, the blue bull becomes more profitable, and the red bull starts to fall off fairly dramatically in terms of profitability. So that's essentially. So how are you going to price the feed, and how it's actually modeled in the system is the new development. But it really has an impact then on how these bulls are going to rank. And I guess my story around feed costs, because when we were doing the work with Leachman's, I'd go to his sale, and we had a bit of a breed object-like thing where I could sit down with a breeder and change the economic assumptions, and I would say to these guys, what are your feed costs? And they'd all say, well, there was a number of them that basically had some, what they call it's kind of like what you might call like forestry lands, I guess you'd say, and they had grazing leases in there that were based on, you know, a lease per cow. So, and it was really cheap. They're like handed down for, you know, they're kind of into this system. So for them, it was like, it's per cow. So, you know, if the cow's bigger, you know, I still pay whatever it is, $50 a year or something to put the cow up in the mountain. So it didn't help my case about why it was important to cost your feed and everything else when these guys really weren't paying for it. So maybe in some situations, in that kind of a weird situation, they're down here where I could have a bigger cow and I pay the same price for my grazing lease, so it doesn't matter. But I think in most situations, there's a real cost to feed, and it's got to be realistic, and it's affecting how animals are ranking. So where are we at? So Hereford has 4 new version 6 indexes, focusing on the north and south, and 3 of those describe a self-replacing index, and they all place, I would think, realistic costs then on maintaining cow condition, which is important, and the 4th is a terminal index. And a terminal index is, if you think about a terminal sire, so we're going to select a sire now, we're going to breed cows, but we're not going to keep any replacements from them. So all that matters there is we got to get a live calf, and it's go for your life in terms of growth and carcass. We don't have to worry about cow weight. We don't have to worry about milk. We don't have to worry about days to calving or any of that in a terminal index. So that is probably one of the biggest mistakes you could make as a commercial buyer is not to get your indexes straight, and you're going to keep replacements, but you're selecting on the terminal index. That would be a big mistake. So you want to make sure the index you pick is the one that matches your as close as you can to your production system. Now, Angus have got 10 new indexes, and I'm going to kind of focus on the top there, and I'll just kind of describe the bottom in one go. But on the top, we've got a domestic index. We've got going to heavier weights in terms of grass production. We're going to heavier weights in terms of grain production. And so those are the 3 finishing systems. We've got our ABI, which is basically a composite of those 3 to put it into one number. And we've got a New Zealand terminal-focused index. And in New Zealand anyways, because I was there's a lot of dairy cows bred to beef bulls, which is basically like a terminal system. And that is costing the feed similar to its cost in Herefords, which is putting a cost on that feed. Basically, then, there's all of the above indexes, but if you're in a situation where your feed is cheap compared to the rest of the producers, that's the low-cost feed version. It basically looks a lot like the top, but there's less emphasis then placed on feed costs. So that's what's happened in Herefords and Angus, and obviously the other breeds. There's Brad Walmsley now is kind of taken over for Steve Barwick. And Brad works with ABRI and Southern Beef Technology and Northern Beef, and they work with the different breeds on setting up their indexes and keeping those things up to date with new economics and trying to get everyone onto version 6 because it's better in terms of how it costs the feed. So I guess when I think about the best way to describe indexes is we're putting weighting on all these different traits, and it's kind of like pressure. Right, you're actually putting some pressure on this trait and some pressure on this trait, and it's all about balance. And we've talked a bit over the last couple of days about this cow size growth, early growth. I want early growth, and I don't want to have big cows because bigger cows eat more. So if I can get the same early growth and carcass weights and stuff without as big a cow, that's more profitable. Well, how do we actually do that? Well, we do that in the index because we're putting positive emphasis on growth rate, but we're putting negative emphasis on cow weight at the same time, and those are correlated traits. And so what's the outcome of that? And I'll show you that in a minute. But I guess you may have heard in the past people talk about bending the growth curve. So if we think about a growth curve, if you look over like 4 years of an animal's life, it's born, it's growing pretty fast, and it starts to taper off, and it gets to about 4 years of age, and now that's its mature weight for its life kind of thing. And these traits are all correlated, so like what Wayne was showing with, I think it was with a nice example with the heterosis for birth weight. Well, if heterosis is increasing growth rate, the calf is actually growing faster in utero too, so they came out a little bit heavier, and that's all part of it. So naturally, if we just select for weaning weights, we're going to get bigger birth weights, and we don't want that, of course, for calving ease. And breeders have done a fantastic job on that end of the growth curve over the past 20, 30 years. How do we get the birth weights down? Because calving ease is obviously nobody wants problems, but we got to have the higher weaning weights because that's what we get paid for. And they have bent that growth curve. So I consider growth curves a bit like trying to bend a piece of pipe. So if I've got a piece of metal pipe and I want to bend it, if I'm just measuring weaning weight, say, and I'm pushing up on weaning weight, well, this end of the pipe, which you can't see, but it just comes up with it, and birth weights goes up and weaning weights go up. But I could bend it if I actually hold both ends of the pipe. So I got to hold this end, which is birth weight, and I got to hold this end, which is weaning weight, and I can pull down on the birth weight and push up on the weaning weight, and I can actually bend the pipe like I want it. I can't do it with just one hand. And that's what they've done with selection, because they've measured all the birth weights, they've measured all the weaning weights, and by pushing up on weaning and pulling down on birth, they've actually bent the growth curve in those animals, which are more profitable. The problem now is we're doing this with this end of the growth curve, but out here, as we're pushing up on growth, this cow weight is going up with it. So the only way we can fix that is if we grab a hold of our growth and weaning weight, and we grab a hold of mature cow weight and keep pushing up on the growth, but we can bend it, and we can actually get cows that are smaller but still producing rapid early growth. But we can only do it if we measure the cow weight. And that's, if you look at recording, and that's not, I'm speaking to the converted in terms of the 2 seed stock herds that are here, but if you look at the recording across the breeds, they got lots of birth weights, they got lots of growth traits. Their recording on the cow side is actually woefully less, and people aren't recording the cows, and that's why we see the graph like we do in the results from the US, where growth rates are going up, but cow weights are going up too. And the only way we're going to do that is if we actually measure cow weights. That's really, really important. So in breedobject, we talk about red greens, or blue graphs, red graphs, and green graphs, and they're basically how the EBVs are basically weighted. So the blue graph is actually how the production traits are weighted, the economic value of those things. The red graphs is how does that translate to what pressure we're going to put on the traits that the seed stock people measure. And the green graphs, which I'll get to in a minute, for Angus anyways, is, okay, if I select on this index, where's it going to take me? The other, I think, important point is it's all based on economics. And I think, because we had a call in from a breeder here recently, and the result, which you'll see in a minute for Angus, is mature cow weight, if we select on that index, it doesn't change. And his point was, who decides that cows shouldn't change weight? You guys have fixed the index, the cows don't change weight. Well, we didn't get an opinion that cows shouldn't change in weight. We actually fit the economics of what the feed cost is and what the value of bigger carcasses and faster growing calves are. And when you boil it all into the index, the answer is cows don't get any bigger. That's the result. It wasn't somebody's opinion that made it that way. So it's based on economics. It's not based on opinions. So this is just to give you an idea. In Hereford self-replacing index, where's the emphasis going? And where does the emphasis go? It's not just the economic value of the trait that determins the emphasis that goes on it, but it's also how much can that trait change? How much variation is there in the trait? So if I put some selection pressure on it, am I going to get big gains or not as big a gains? And those things, along with the economics, really determines how much emphasis goes on those things. So what you'll see generally, if you look at the big bars, we'll just focus on those. We're trying to put more calving ease in the breed. That's an important area of emphasis. We're still trying to push up growth rate, because that's a big economic driver. At the same time, we're trying to push down cow weight. So again, that's trying to bend that piece of pipe. And that gets back to the question over here about, what about kind of a standalone EBV, which is just cow weight and weaning weight. That's what that is doing. It's basically, let's try and push up growth while pushing down cow size. Let's improve days to calving. And finally, down at this end, some emphasis on carcass traits. But what you see here is a lot of the emphasis is in terms of calving ease, growth rate, let's keep cows more moderate, and improve our days to calving on the index. In terms of Angus, it's why could it be slightly different? Obviously, it's all cattle in Australia. It's all the same grading system, et cetera, et cetera. Why can we get different results in Angus than in Herefords? In some cases, the genetic parameters, how these traits are correlated, are slightly different between the breeds. So that can drive some differences between them. But in general, again, we're not putting as much emphasis there on calving ease. And I guess we saw some results earlier about birth weight and things like that. So maybe the pressure on calving ease and Angus doesn't need to be as high. We're trying to push up early growth, and we're trying, in the other direction, again, trying to push down cow weight. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And finally, again, emphasis there on our carcass traits. Just to give an example here. Someone asked earlier, what about scrotal circumference predicting fertility traits? There's a relationship, but we're not putting a lot of emphasis there on scrotal circumference because the relationship with the fertility traits, it's there, but it's not that high. So we're better to put the emphasis on the fertility trait itself. So this is the green graph for Angus, and we put all that pressure on those different traits. Where's it going to take us in terms of what's the expected response to selection? And these things are somewhat dependent on the animals we put into it, but it does give you a general indication of where things are going to go, which I think people get somewhat confident in. If we're to select on this index, we're going to still push up calving ease while pushing up growth. Birth weight and gestation length are going to come down a little bit, but the important one there is right there, and it's not very far from the line. We call it a wash. That's your mature cow weight. So the point is, growth rate's still going to go up, but these cows aren't going to get any bigger if we selected on that index purely, but that's because that is the most profitable situation in terms of the production environment. Again, carcass weight and eye muscle areas are going to go up. Our fats aren't going to change very much. This is all standardized to the same scale, but our marbling is still going to go up. So what's changed? We got a better description. There's a better description of the cow and how feed's modeled in the new indexes, and we've added feed efficiency as an objective trait. So that is an important thing. The other thing to think about, I guess, when you think about a lot of Matt's work, how's this going to fit into breedobject? There's a lot of functionality in breedobject that isn't turned on yet because we don't have the traits measured in real life, but we've got them modeled in the production system. So the differences in feed efficiency are modeled in the production system. So if there's ways to get these breeding values into the index, and that's it for indexes.
Any questions for Steve? Ian?
I think it's worth saying with that green graph for the commercial producers in the room that actually... it's working. I think it's worth saying with that green graph that they're available on the Breed Society websites for all different breeds, and it represents the top 10% as if that was a bull. If you use the top 10% of bulls on that index, that is how the traits in your herds would move.
Right.
And I think it's worth commercial producers having a look at that and saying, well, do we want our traits in our herd to look at to move in those directions for the individual traits? Very easy way to utilise the information.
Oh, thanks, Ian.
Steve, just a little bit of an explanation around, I suppose, we understand the relative differences in dollar value is the way to compare bulls, but the difference in dollar value is a lot larger on the current index. Can you just give us a little bit of an explanation why, like if we're going to compare a breed average or a 50th percentile bull with the top 10 percentile bull, that dollar difference has changed reasonably significantly with these new indexes?
Yeah. So very, very good observation. So if you think about if feed costs go up, right, and you model higher feed costs in the index, so then if there's, let's say cow weight, for example. So we've got genetic differences for cow weight, but now we're actually taking that genetic difference for cow weight and we're translating that into, okay, well, how much more feed does that result in? But now we're going to take that feed difference and multiply it by a bigger number. So the fact that prices are going up, feed costs are going, the actual cattle prices go up and feed costs go up, it actually creates more standard deviation in your index, I guess you'd say, because there's actually more differences now in profit. If feed was free, the difference then in cow weight doesn't change. Like we could just line them all up and just feed them all this free feed, and the cows, the difference in cow weight doesn't translate to any difference then in the indexes. But as the feed goes up and up in price, that translates into more and more differences in the dollar values. And that gives you that spread that what you're seeing. So when the spread goes up, a lot of it is around there's a few things. I'll touch on a few things, but the one thing is it's a lot around the economic assumptions that are in there. So if you've assumed that feed costs are going to be, more, if it's going to cost more to feed animals in the future, that gets modeled in the index, and that just spreads things out anyways, just around the costs. But the other thing to think about in terms of it's all based on the EBVs. Obviously, it's the EBVs on the animals that get weighted by different economic factors and things to create that dollar value in the end. So if you got more spread in your EBVs, you actually then spread out your dollar values more. And what we're seeing, because of a few things, EBVs are going to start to spread out more. And one thing is, we've got in some of these breeds, you've got these bin projects, right, that are actually measuring more carcass traits, which are so sorely needed in a lot of breeds. And that actually spreads if you don't have, it basically spreads your EBVs out more. To take the extreme case, I'd say, if I was to do an EBV for a breed and they didn't have any data, this is the extreme case, it doesn't exist, I was just a kind of silly example, but if they don't have any data, you just give every animal breed average. They all just have breed average EBVs, and there's no spread. The more data you feed into it, the more you identify winners and losers, highs and lows, and you spread the EBVs out more. The other thing that's happening is we're throwing genomics into it, right? And like Wayne said, genomics is a better pedigree, but it actually then puts more accuracy, and if you have more accuracy, it's more information, you actually spread the EBVs out more because you're more confident to predict that those differences are real. So there's two things happening, probably more higher costs in the system, which tends to spread them out, but the EBVs themselves are starting to get more spread in them. And the two things together are resulting in bigger differences in your dollar indexes, and that's what you're seeing.
Just as I hand this over, so I suppose if it's so dependent on current circumstances, how often do the versions get updated? Is that pre-scheduled, and did the gap between, you said we're at version 6 now, the fact that there's potentially a bit of a gap in updates there, is that part of the reason why that dollar value changed?
Yeah, so it's a good point. So there are two things there. There's version changes, so let's say version 4 to version 6, and you want to migrate breeds across as quick as you can. But even if the version doesn't change, you want to keep your economics current. And there's actually, it's a balance, I guess, in terms of adoption and psychology and everything else with breeders, that if you're changing the system all the time, people lose confidence in it. So you got to stay current, but you don't want to be changing it every week or every month. So that it's a balance between, when you got to update the economic assumptions. So, you want to keep your economic assumptions current with the current version of the indexes. If you have version 4 to version 6 that's like a technological change, and you want to make those available as they are available. But I think I don't know the exact situation, but I think it's it's hard to point the finger in terms of when changes don't get made, because breeds can be reluctant to change because it's change, right? And then bulls are going to change and a lot of questions and everything else. So it's that balance between we want to make a change, but when's a good time to change is not the same for all the breeds, basically.
Steve, I just want to make a comment about genomics. How long we've done genomics? 7 years. So we've done genomics for about 7 years, and every cow on the place is genomic tested. But when we first put genomics into the EBV, the thing that really changed was the spread. So we were selecting strongly against birth weights over +7 in Angus, so we didn't have a lot of animals like that. But when genomics came in the first year, that was the main thing that hit you between the eyes, the number of animals that suddenly were over 7 and up to 13, +13. So that immediately gave an increase in those animals were either stayed in or went out, but it was quite a dramatic thing in that particular, in the birth weight, but other traits moved obviously too, but it certainly made a huge difference, because we just didn't think we had any animals that were plus 13 for birth weight.
We had the exact same thing. We had birth weights that went up, but our breed average birth weight, our herd average birth weight was exactly the same. So there was as many much lower birth weights as higher birth weights, but it was certainly an adjustment for clients to see a Waroona animal at +7 where we'd never ever had them over +5, so or higher. So that was an issue, but there was as many on the other side that made your herd average the same, and I would imagine the same for any lead.
Yeah, no, that's, I'll get to a couple more questions, but yeah, I totally appreciate that. That was definitely, seeing genomics be implemented and answering all the questions from breeders, and that's one we would get a lot. And typically when the calls would come in, it would always be, my bull went from, I could sell him at +5, but now he's +13 and I can't sell him, and you killed my bull, and what are you going to do about it? And, could the one, in America the scale's a little bit different, but at 3, at basically at +4 and above, no one wants to buy the bull, and this bull was a 2.8 or something, and he went to 4.2, and you killed the bull. He goes, I could sell him at a 3.5, could you get him back to a 3.5? He wanted to negotiate, and I said, well, it doesn't really work that way. But it was always, they never called to say the bull went down. It's always he went up. But I think that it comes down to the fact that we know it is more accurate, and we know we're actually, that spread is more real in the animals, and so it's better to know. In your case, we just didn't have the information before to say he's a +13, but now we do, and that's why we get more spread.
Right.
At the back, we had a couple.
Yeah, can I just ask a quick
Oh,
question?
sorry. You were,
Yes.
yeah.
I got the microphone.
Yeah,
so
you
we're
win.
all-
Okay.
And look, and hopefully this is not a stupid question. You always worry about asking a stupid question. But look, about feed conversion, I mean, you've talked about that as an index. Can you just elaborate a bit on actually how you get that feed conversion as an index and how that's been recorded for commercial breeders to be able to utilise that? Because I think it's a big issue for me anyway.
Yeah. So, and Wayne talked a little bit about feed conversion. So there's feed conversion, which is basically, typically we might call it feed to gain ratio. So in a feed lot, how much do they eat versus how much do they gain, and it's a ratio. But like Matt said, selection genetically on ratios gets problematic. So you're better off to actually work with the components. So in a system like breedobject, you actually model feed costs. So we try and predict how much the animal's going to eat, and we also try and predict how much it's going to grow. And the growth has got value, and that gets a plus in the ledger, but his predicted feed cost has a negative. And so the two things is actually predicting feed eaten, and it's predicting revenue in terms of carcass and live weight growth separately, and it's putting dollars on this and dollars on that. So it doesn't actually calculate a feed conversion number and give a weight to that. It actually predicts the feed eaten, and it predicts the revenue. Well, it's modeled in that there's more than one index. So there's a grass-based index and a grain-based index. But how do we get, as an industry, at improving feed, what we might call feed efficiency? And that, I think Wayne's going to talk later about, so maybe I'll cut it a little bit short because he's probably going to cover a lot of what we're going to talk about. But the EBVs that you see in Australia is net feed intake. So when I went out to Trangie in 1995, the field day was all about net feed intake. And I remember Paul Arthur, who's just retired from New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, sat up there and gave a presentation because they had the first animals had been measured for feed intake, and they had them in pens, and they said, look at these two animals, their weight was the same, and their average daily gain was the same, but this animal ate a lot more than this animal. And the animal that gained the same for the same weight with less feed intake has a better what we call a net feed intake. In America, they call it residual feed intake, basically the same concept. And the idea of that trait versus feed conversion ratio is, like Wayne showed this morning, if they grow faster, they've got a better feed conversion ratio. And so if we just selected on that, we would actually make bigger animals. And then you get to the cow herd side of things, and you say, well, that's not so good because my cows are bigger, and that's maybe not as efficient. So the idea was to pull it apart and say, for the same amount of growth and the same amount of weight gain, or same amount of weight gain and the same amount of average size, what's the difference in feed intake? So the EBV in breed plan and in breed object is actually that net feed intake, but that only comes from records where people have actually measured feed intake. So there's these bin projects, for example, where the cattle go through a system like the Vitelli system, where it measures the individual intake on the animal, and that's the records that go into net feed intake. Okay.
Yeah, just with that, the weightings on the Hereford index, I saw that obviously we penalise for mature cow weight, but we're rewarding for 600-day weight. Are we fooling ourselves in that we think that we can achieve a high 600-day weight and more than likely achieve a lower mature cow weight?
Yeah. So what drives that, or what makes it possible, is what's the genetic correlation between the two traits. So if the genetic correlation between those two traits was 1, you can't do anything about it. You know, they're both, it's the same thing. So, but in truth, and I don't know exactly what the genetic correlation is between 600 and mature. Maybe Matt does. Oh, he's giving me the face that he doesn't. So stick with that. But the point is, it's not 1, and I'm gonna guess 0.6 or something. We'd have to look it up. But the point is, and it's pretty similar across the growth curve, whether it's weaning to birth or, you know, at those 600 and mature. Obviously, the closer you get to mature, the higher the correlation is going to be. But in that, in that early growth phase, you can push that up and pull down on the cow size because that correlation is not 1. And it's most dramatic if you look back in time. Well, I guess we saw it with those breed differences there. You know, over the last, whatever it was, 30 years, you saw the black line, and for all the breeds, growth was going up. But for a lot of them, they've kept the birth weight pretty flat. So they've bent the growth curve on that end. And that's because the correlation between birth and weaning is not, or birth and yearling in that case is different than 1. And it's the same between that and mature. But yeah, so it has to do with because the correlation, you can, obviously they're highly correlated, so if you just ignore it, the one will go up with the other one. But because the correlation is not 1, you can find bulls that don't match the pattern. There will be a bull whose mature cow weight isn't any higher, but his 600-day weight is, and then okay, well he's better on the index, so he gets picked, and that's what drives the outcome. Always.
Yeah, it's still time. Yeah, lunch is here. No, would you like the mic? Sorry.
It's better for the recording. Unless it's one of those hand grenades.
Actually, Steve, it's the opposite of a hand grenade.
Oh,
It's
okay.
to support what Matt said about the having mature cow weight and body condition, and whether you should have a single trait, which is mature cow weight adjusted for body composition, or whether you should have separate traits. So it's also supporting exactly what you've been saying. And really, really simply, think about those two as separate traits. Like, I 100% support what Matt said about having them as separate traits. The reason is bigger animals eat more, so you want a negative economic weight on mature cow weight. Everyone happy with that? With body condition score, you actually want a positive economic weight on body condition score, because it is the low body condition animals that trigger supplementary feeding decisions. So if they are in higher condition, then they can be in the paddock for longer before you start supplementary feeding. So you've got two traits that actually have a negative economic value on mature cow weight and a positive economic value on body condition. So it's just like bending the growth curve or doing the other things. It's actually changing that cow composition by having positive weight on condition score, negative weighting on mature cow weight. So to me, it's really, really clear that what Matt said about having them as separate traits and building them into an index like Steve's saying is 100% the right way to go.
Definitely not a hand grenade. That was awesome. Thanks.
Sorry, I'll just make a couple of quick comments around this subject, a bit unrelated. The first is that indexes are only as good as the recording of every trait that goes into them. And when we were working in the early days in Northern Australia, we got constant comments from breeders that they select on the index, but all they're changing is weight. It's just pushing changes in weight, despite the masses of pressure that's put on days to calving, it's not changing anything. And that was because all the data that was coming in for Brahmins was weight, and we were getting very little days to calving information, and the index can't, generate data where there isn't any. And the other thing is that everybody in the room has, if they want to, can create their own index. We've got facilities within the breedobject system and advice from people in the Department of Ag, in our SBTSs, TBTSs, and at AgBoo to help people develop their own indexes for their own production system, their own target markets, if they think that they're not well represented in the breed-based indexes that are available. Full stop.
Any more?
Here we go.
I recently read an article in a bull from a stud breeder about emphasising that they weigh all their calves at birth, and it also said that there were many studs that don't weigh all their calves at birth. How do you put that into the index and make the index accurate?
Yeah. So that's a really good point. So what goes into the index is actually the EBVs, right? So, and in that case, if the breeder's actually not measuring birth weight, his EBVs are less accurate, but they don't spread as much either. So, because we get into this argument quite a bit about indexes, this is, well, this trait isn't as accurate, so you shouldn't weight it as much in the index. But the point in the index is that's the economic value of a unit of that trait. And what happens when we have traits that are, poorly recorded and not as accurate, we just don't get the spread. So his birth weight doesn't have as much influence then in his index because it's not going to spread out as much because he didn't actually measure it. Now that's a problem for you as a commercial buyer because it hasn't identified his good ones, but it hasn't identified his bad ones either. And so all his birth weights now are going to go in, not quite entirely, because obviously from different moms and different dads, and they would have a different average from the parents, but otherwise he doesn't have a record. And it'll be correlated. It's correlated in the model with the growth and everything else. But it's a bit of buyer beware when you're out as a commercial buyer buying bulls. And we were talking yesterday about decisions about this bull and that bull and for the breeding program. But and I borrow this from a colleague in New Zealand, Jason Archer. We did a segment together. And the point we made in the workshop for commercial bull buyers was the most important decision you make is what driveway you pull up. So whose bull sale are you going to go to buy your bulls? That's the most important decision you make. From there, you pick this bull versus that bull, and he's got a bit more growth, and he's got better cow weight, and et cetera, et cetera. It's like being pulled by a motorboat on a water ski, okay? And you're tied with a rope, and you can cut to the left, and you can cut to the right a bit behind the boat, but where you're going is basically where that boat's going. And it's like that in bull selection. You determine first whose boat you're going to hook on behind, and then you get to the bull sale and you think, well, I'm going to pick that bull over that bull, and you can go a bit to the left and a bit to the right, but essentially if you go to that bull sale every year, you're following that boat and you're going to go where they're going. So in that case, if you're going to someone's bull sale who doesn't measure birth weight, well, don't expect to make a whole lot of progress in your herd in terms of birth weight problems because the information isn't there. And that's a bit of buyer beware in terms of who's recording what traits. So his indexes actually would be slightly less accurate because birth weight's an important part of the index, and his EBVs are less accurate.
I was just going to add to that to say that the thing is that you can still get a birth weight EBV while you're not measuring birth weights because they're predicted from the other parameters. So that's the bit that looks a little bit misleading. It's not misleading.
Right.
And that's why they're less accurate, because they haven't been measured, but they still exist.
Yeah. So birth weight, I think birth weight's a great example. It's fairly highly heritable. But just to throw in the genomics piece, so let's say those animals were genotyped, then I'm more confident, there is more accuracy. I'm more confident in the numbers because they're more accurate, because those animals, it's not just an animal without a birth weight, he's actually genotyped. And if you got the live weights, they're correlated. Now the disadvantage for that particular breeder, if he's just doing the live weights, his bigger animals will have bigger birth weight EBVs. And that'll correlate with calving ease, which will be poor calving ease EBVs. So that's actually not to his advantage, right? He'd be better off to identify the good ones actually measuring the birth weights. But genomics is becoming more powerful, and in terms of there's a lot of data behind birth weight in the analysis, and so just genotype. My own personal opinion is we're better off in terms of breeders, if they're not going to take good birth weights, they're probably better not to take birth weights at all. And so they're better off just to genotype. We need breeders taking birth weights, but we need good birth weights, not estimates or guesstimates or anything like that. And then those breeders are probably better off not to try and just to genotype. Matt said something about kind of garbage in, garbage out a little bit. He didn't use those words, but the point is it's only as good as the system. And so having a multiple trait system like breed plan, where the mature weight's correlated with the growth traits as it should be. So these higher growth animals, although a breeder's not measuring cow weight, his EBVs are going to go up. And the only way for him to benefit maybe from lower mature cow weights in the index, he's going to have to start measuring some cows and picking those cows that bend the growth curve and change the levels in his herd. So